Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our lectures on problems in international politics. We saw last week that, yes, the contemporary world order is unipolar. America is preeminent. But what about the future? Is America's preeminence at stake? Is it threatened? And if so, why is this due to China's rise? This is the question we would have a look at today. The consequences of China's rise, title of the class, the consequences of China's rise. Balance or parity, question mark. We saw last week at the very beginning that when the Cold War came to an end in 1989, 1991, various scenarios were proposed, and they predicted the return to multipolarity, either on the short run or on the long run. On the short run, this was the case for Kissinger. This was the case for Kenneth Waltz. On the long run, Krauthammer announced a unipolar moment, but by definition, the moment is short, followed by multipolarity, and they all agreed upon the 21st century characterized by the presence of 5-6 major powers, that is to say the US, Russia, Japan, China, India, and maybe Europe or Germany, depending on the specific prediction. Since then, however, predictions changed. On the one hand, because unipolarity prevailed and still is prevailing 30 years after the end of the Cold War. It is a historical period and not merely a short moment. And on the other hand, because as early as in the midst of the 1990s, so 2 or 3 years after the predictions of Kissinger or of Kenneth Waltz, China gradually became the only power among the 4 or 5 potential competitors. China became the only power to be considered as being likely to challenge America's preeminence. For instance, if you look at our documents, in 1997, the Pentagon's Quadrennial Defense Review acknowledged, I quote, that in the period beyond 2015, and we now are living in the period beyond 2015, in the period beyond 2015, there is a possibility, I quote, that a regional great power or a global peer competitor may emerge. And the Pentagon was thinking of China because of its potential to become a major military power in Asia. So in Asia, maybe a regional great power or even a global competitor would emerge. In 2001, of course, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the Bush administration focused on this terrorist threat, but immediately after, during the second mandate of George W. Bush's presidency, this is what the Quadrennial Defense Review wrote: of the major and emerging powers, China has the greatest potential to compete militarily with the US. And Obama, after coming to the White House, after arriving at the White House in 2009, so during the first year of his presidency, he held the US-China Summit, and this is what he said: the relationship between the US and China will shape the 21st century. So he acknowledged that sooner or later, during the 21st century, China, and no longer the US alone, would manage the international system. This is a kind of explicit or at least implicit recognition of China's role in the future world order. Of course, and we will come back to this towards the end of this chapter, Trump, ever since he came to the White House, perceives China as to be America's major adversary. American decision makers are not the only ones to propose such predictions. So did, and so do, academics, scholars. For instance, Ronald Taman and his co-authors in the book Power Transition, which was published in the year 2000. Power transitions, this is what the book wrote. The key question is not whether China will be the dominant nation, but when it will become dominant. So Ronald Taman and his co-authors expect China to become dominant, that is to say, to replace the US as the preeminent power. John Mersheimer, the American offensive neorealist, in his book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, the first edition was published in 2001, so almost 20 years ago. This is what he wrote: a wealthy China would not be a status quo power. It will be an aggressive state determined to achieve regional hegemony. And among the hundreds and hundreds of books that were published, I would like to refer to a pretty serious and fairly balanced book. David Chambaud, he's a specialist of China. China goes global, and he calls China a partial power. So the aim today, ladies and gentlemen, is to make a presentation of the underlying theoretical assumption of these predictions, because all these predictions refer to an underlying theory, the power cycle theory, though not always explicitly mentioning his approach. The power cycle theory, as distinguished from the balance of power theory. At first sight, we might establish a kind of comparison between a potential future characterized by two major powers, the US and China. A comparison with what was the case during the Cold War. There were two powers too, the US and Russia, the US and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, not Russia. So at first sight, we might be tempted to apply the balance of power theory, which claimed throughout the Cold War, when I was a student, that the then prevailing stability was due to the balance of terror, of nuclear terror, the military balance between the US and the USSR. Actually, those who claim that China will rise and will threaten America's preeminence do not refer to this balance of power theory. They implicitly or explicitly apply the power cycle theory. This is also the case, ladies and gentlemen, of Joseph Nye. Please listen to Joseph Nye. He was interviewed in 2017.
Start by moving straight to Professor Joseph Nye, because 20 years ago, the world debated, is American hegemony declining? Or I should say, American scholars debated this vigorously. Great moment of national angst. And Professor Joseph Nye, in a book which was elegant and reassuring to America, published Bound to Lead. So, Joe, are you still bound to lead? Or is US hegemony declining?
Well, as it so happens, there's going to be a son or daughter of Bound to Lead, which is coming out next month, which is entitled, Is the American Century Over? 1941, Henry Luce proclaimed the American century. So I'm asking, by 2041, what will the world look like? Most people think that China is going to replace the US. And this leads to the question of what's called hegemonic transition. So for example, in the 1930s, when the US had replaced Britain, but didn't live up to its responsibilities, the argument that some make is that led to poor global governance of the Great Depression. Some people say something like this may be happening now as China replaces the US. I think it's wrong for two reasons. First of all, I don't think China will be more powerful than U.S. in 2041. So we can go into that later or in detail. But even more important, there's a great myth about the past of American hegemony. At best, when the Americans had the most power of all, right after 1945, they couldn't control things. They couldn't prevent the Soviet Union getting an A-bomb. They couldn't prevent the communists taking over in China. In 1956, again, when Americans had enormous power, they couldn't prevent our allies, Britain and France and Israel, invading Egypt. They couldn't prevent the Soviet Union from invading Hungary. So there's a myth of the past, which is that somehow the Americans had control. This led to good global governance. And now the Americans are losing control, and so global governance will go down. I think it's wrong on two counts. One is it has a myth about the past, a golden glow of the past. And second, I don't think the Americans are going to decline that much by 2041.
Mm-hmm.
So you heard Joseph Nye, and you know Joseph Nye, he's the American liberal transnational theorist who coined the concept, the very famous concept of soft power. And he did this at the very end of the 1980s to refute Paul Kennedy's idea of America declining just as the UK had declined roughly 1 century before. And the argument of Joseph Nye consisted in saying we cannot compare the US to the UK because nowadays US in the 1980s, the US basically is leading thanks to soft power, which is more important than hard power in the contemporary world. He, therefore, I think, in what he said in this interview that you listened to, is that he's self-contradictory because he claims that actually to claim that America was leading is a kind of myth. Well, because never were the US able to impose their will, not even on their own allies, the British and the French in 1956, for instance. Well, he's self-contradictory because if he claimed 30 years ago that America, thanks to its soft power, would go on leading, he cannot say now that actually America never was the leading power. Anyway, whatever this contradiction, what I want you to remember is his expression, the hegemonic transition. Hegemonic transition is the other term used, the more popular expression, to define the power cycle theory. Hegemonic transition actually is a combination of the two major versions of the power cycle theory. The one is the hegemonic war theory, due to Robert Gilpin in his book War and Change in World Politics. Hegemonic war theory, so hegemonic comes from hegemonic, in the expression hegemonic transition, hegemonic comes from Gilpin, hegemonic war theory. And hegemonic transition, the term transition comes from Organski's power transition theory. Organsky is the name on the bottom of the cover of this book. Actually, Organsky was the one who proposed this theory as early as in the 50s, and Temin and the other authors are disciples of Organsky. So I will combine, just as Nye to some extent did, I will combine these two theories to show you the underlying assumptions, the underlying postulates shared by all those, be they politicians, academics, experts, journalists, who expect China to become a challenge, a threat to America's preeminence. So what is the starting point of this hegemonic transition theory? The starting point is to claim, as all the realists do, and as all mainstream scholars in international relations do, in the discipline do, to claim that international relations takes place in an anarchical environment. There is no authority above states. However, and this is the important difference which distinguishes power cycle theorists from adherents of the balance of power theory. According to power cycle theorists, the anarchical structure, the anarchical arrangement of international relations does not mean the absence of a hierarchical distribution of power resources among the major powers. In other words, they claim that the prevailing order, the prevailing structure of the system is neither multipolar nor bipolar, but that it is unipolar. There is one single major power on top of the system. And this major power manages, thanks to its resources in the economic, in the military, and to some extent also in the demographic domain. This is all first and foremost the case of Organsky and his disciples. Thanks to its economic, military, and demographic resources, the major power aims at and succeeds in maintaining the stability of the system. It maintains the system, stability of the system, stability in the meaning of absence of any risk of major war breaking out, opposing the majority of the major powers, the unipolar one, the preeminent one, and the secondary one. It aims at, and the prevalent, the preeminent power aims at and succeeds in managing successfully the system thanks to the international norms, thanks to the international institutions that it establishes. These institutions, of course, consolidate over the long run the major powers' preeminence, but the international rules also benefit to the majority of secondary powers. That is to say, these secondary powers are associated to the international order established and ruled by the prevailing power. These secondary powers are therefore called satisfied powers. But logically, there are some secondary powers who would like to get rid of the existing order, who would like to become preeminent power. These secondary powers are called dissatisfied powers, revisionist states, challengers, and Organsky in his theory uses the term contender. A contender is a secondary power eager to change the system and whose resources, measured in terms of gross domestic product, whose economic resources reach the threshold of 80% of the prevailing power's economic resources as measured in terms of GDP. I repeat, a system is stable thanks to unipolarity and thanks to the fact that the majority of secondary powers are satisfied with this system, with this order, despite the presence of one or various secondary powers who are dissatisfied. And among these, there may be one whose resources reach 80%, and in this case of the prevailing power's GDP, and in this case, this secondary power is called contender. Most of the times, I go into the details, most of the times the system is stable in the meaning of no risk of major war. Though some conflicts may emerge, of course. Conflicts in the strict meaning of divergent interests, clashing aspirations between the major powers. So various nations, be they regional powers, be they secondary powers, want to change the rules of the system in order to impose to spread their values, their ideologies, their interests. Most of the time, and as long as unipolarity prevails, as long, in other words, as there is a gap regarding economic resources between the prevailing and the secondary powers, as long as stability prevails, these conflicts are regulated most of the times peacefully. That is to say, within the international institutions established precisely to regulate peacefully conflicts. Economic conflicts are regulated in the institutions established at Bretton Woods after World War II, And security conflicts regarding security are most of the time regulated thanks to negotiations, thanks to cooperation, thanks to dialogue within the United Nations, established in order to prevent any new major war to break out in 1945. Sometimes, of course, these negotiations fail, and therefore limited resorts to wars exist in order to put an end to the risk of a regional instability from becoming too dangerous for the overall stability, for the overall international order. This was the case, for instance, with Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The US and its allies, thanks to a UN resolution, launched Operation Desert Storm to force Saddam Hussein, who had threatened the regional stability and the oil market stability by invading Kuwait, to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw. But these regional, local, limited wars against regional, local troublemakers from the perspective of the major power and those states benefiting from the existing order, of course, these limited wars do not threaten the overall stability. They actually are somehow necessary to maintain this stability. So there are limited wars, but there are no risk of major wars. We saw this last week, so very quickly. There are no risks of major wars opposing the major powers. Why? Because the secondary powers, by definition, are too weak. Their military resources are too weak to challenge the prevailing power, and the prevailing power has no need to go to war. It imposes its will thanks to its mere reputation, and it has no interest in going to war, because by doing so, it will incite secondary powers to try to counterbalance the system. So the system is stable during a fairly long period, but of course, it will not remain stable eternally, perpetually. Why? Because sooner or later, the prevailing powers' resources will start to decline. They will decline. They will be declining, not necessarily in absolute terms, but relatively to the rising capacities of secondary powers. This will be the case mainly for two major reasons. The first reason is an economic one, the so-called law of uneven growth, the law of uneven growth. By definition, the dominant nation in the past was the first to enter the growth cycle, unless it would not be preponderant. Being the first to enter the growth cycle, it also will be the first to be confronted with a kind of slowing down of its growth rate. So its economic growth will slow down at the same moment when the rising powers' growth rate will be accelerating. Secondary powers, by definition, entered the growth cycles later than the dominant power. So when the dominant power is slowing down, the secondary power's economic growth rate will be booming. And sooner or later, so the secondary powers will come close to matching the predominant power's economic resources. This is the first economic reason. There is a second reason why the decline of the major powers will sooner or later occur. It is a strategic reason, what historians such as Paul Kennedy call imperial overstretch. Imperial overstretch. The meaning of this concept is the following one. By definition, an international order profits the prevailing power, which amounts to say that the prevailing power must maintain the stability of this order. In other words, it must be ready to intervene militarily in different regions of the world where there are risks of regional instability. Because if there are too many regional instabilities, the global stability sooner or later will be concerned too. So in order to govern, in order to rule the system, the prevailing power must dedicate a fairly significant part of its economic resources to military spendings in order to be ready to intervene militarily and to prevent a regional crisis from escalating to a major one. These military spendings, however, have a negative impact upon the economic productivity. This is the claim of the theory. I guess in reality, things are much more complicated. You know that internet is due to a military application at the very beginning. It's the civilian application of a military invention. Anyway, power cycle theorists claim that to dedicate too significant a part of a GDP to military spendings will have a negative impact upon economic productivity. And of course, secondary powers do not, by definition, since they are not responsible, they do not manage the stability of the system, they do not need to dedicate so important a part of their resources to military spending. So they can dedicate all their economic resources to go on improving their economic growth. So this strategic evolution will add its impact to the law of uneven growth, with the result that over time, the structure of the international system, the power distribution, in other words, of the international system will change. It will no longer be characterized by unipolarity with a huge gap between the prevailing and the secondary power, but it will be characterized by parity. That is to say, parity prevails when a rising secondary power reaches the threshold of 80% of the still but already declining major powers GDP. Parity and not balance. This is very important, and here we have the distinction between the balance of power theory and the power cycle theory. Both analyze a system with two major powers roughly possessing the same amount, an equal amount of economic and to some extent military power capacities. But this equality is called balance by balance of power theorists, who claim that such a distribution is synonymous with stability. And according to them, it's the gap which is likely to favor the outbreak of a war. Power cycle theorists call such an equality, a rough equality, they call it parity. And they claim that such a parity is war-prone. It is a war-prone, synonymous with a war-prone theory, period. It is synonymous with a transition period from the past stable period thanks to unipolarity and the future unstable period because of parity. Why then should such a transition period, according to power cycle theorists, why should such a transition period be war-prone? Why should there be a higher risk of war? According to these theorists, a transition period is war-prone if the rising challenger is a revisionist state, a dissatisfied state eager to overthrow the existing order, which amounts to saying that in the case of the rising power being a satisfied one, then a peaceful transition is possible. At least it is conceivable, imaginable, for the very simple reason that the rising power accepts the rules of the game and to some extent does not necessarily want to overthrow the system. But in the case of the rising secondary power being a challenger, a revisionist state, that is to say a contender, to quote Organsky, then a war may break out via two mechanisms. There are two possibilities for war to break out, two processes which can lead to a war, indirectly or directly. The war first, opposing the still preeminent but gradually declining power to the slowly rising power, to the quickly rising power. The war can occur directly first. Why? Because of the so-called preventive motivation for war of the still hegemonic power. The preventive motivation for war. The still prevailing power is afraid, feels threatened by the rise of the contender. So what may it be tempted to think? It may be tempted to come to the conclusion that it is in his interest to stop, to block the rise of the challenger, of the contender, when this contender is not too strong yet. In other words, the still prevailing power may be tempted to resort to violence before it will be too late to do so, before being forced to do so under less favorable conditions in the case of its adversary continuing to increase its military resources. And according to international relations scholars, and above all, according to Gilpin in his War and Change in World Politics, this is what happened in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the rise of Athens was perceived by Sparta as a threat to Sparta's hegemony. So the fear that this rise, the expansionism of Athens, inspired to the leaders of Sparta, compelled them to declare war, the war that became the Peloponnesian War. But a war opposing the prevailing power to the quickly rising secondary power, in the case of this secondary power being a dissatisfied revisionist state, a contender, such a war can also occur indirectly, not directly, but indirectly. Why? Because of the aggressive behavior of the rising secondary power in its own region, or the behavior which is perceived to be aggressive by the still prevailing power. In this case, the rising power, impatient to some extent, eager to accelerate the historical process in order to become the preeminent power, is tempted to expand in its own region. But by doing so, the still prevailing power must intervene, feels compelled to intervene in order to maintain its credibility, and of course also in order to help its allies in the region, in order to prevent the rising challenger to expand too much. In other words, there is a risk of a kind of local conflict launched by the rising power's expansionist ambitions. There is that such a limited conflict escalates into a major conflict because of the intervention that the still prevailing power compels itself to stage in order to try to maintain the existing order. And according to historians and IR scholars accepting this power cycle theory, this is what happens both in 1914 and in 1939. Germany in 1914 was an ally of Austria, which declared war to Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand of Austria. So Germany, in the case of the victory, would profit from this victory in Central Europe, thus becoming too powerful for the British, whose preeminence was depending on a balance on the continent, because the balance on the continent permitted Great Britain to be worldwide prevailing. And the same is true in 1939, after attacking Austria, after attacking Czechoslovakia, Nazi Germany attacked Poland. And this third expansionist move convinced the British and its French allies to intervene in order to try to block Hitler's expansionism, because this expansionism obviously became a threat for the prevalence of the British, or for what at that time was believed to be British preeminence. Let's come back to the theory. According to the power cycle theory, the war that results from the confrontation between the slowly declining and the rapidly rising challenger, the slowly declining hegemon, and the rapidly rising contender. This war is more than a mere war. It is not merely a great war, major war. It is what Gilpin, influenced by Hegemony, the French scholar, it is what Gilpin calls a hegemonic war, and therefore his theory is called the hegemonic war theory. Hegemonic war is, I quote, a war that determines which state will be dominant and will govern the system. A hegemonic war is a war which, whatever its immediate triggering causes, will be at the origin of a new system governed by a new hegemonic power. This states that will govern the new system with new rules, with new institutions, etc., is not, or at least it is rarely, this is what the theorists say, the rising contender. Why? Because the contender will be defeated. This is what the theory says. Will be defeated during the war against the coalition of the satisfied powers. In other words, the satisfied powers will prevail during the war. At least this is what happened during the two historical examples which are given by the theorists. If we take the example of the Peloponnesian War, it was won by Sparta, not by the rising contender Athens. If we take the example of World War I and World War II, it was not, they were not won. These two wars are considered to be one single cycle. They were not won by neither Imperial Germany in 1914-18 nor by Nazi Germany in 39-45. The wars were won by the satisfied powers, the alliances, the coalitions of the satisfied power. So the new hegemonic power will not be the challenger, the contender, the rising revisionist states. It will be either a third-party state, because such a third-party state will profit from the exhaustion of all the powers involved in the hegemonic war. And this is what happened in ancient Greece. Though Sparta won the war, it did not profit from its victory because it was exhausted by the war. So there was a third-party state, in other words, Macedonia, first of Philip and then of Alexander the Great, who became the new prevailing power in the then Greek city system before expanding on Alexander and creating the empire which earned Alexander the name of Alexander the Great. So either it's a third-party state or it is the most powerful unit within the coalition of satisfied states. And this is what happened during World War I and World War II, considered to be one cycle of one major hegemonic war, 45, that is to say 31 years, sorry. The most powerful state within the coalition of satisfied power will profit from the war. It will profit from a kind of windfall. It is what is called a windfall profit. That is to say, since the formerly prevailing power is declining by definition, otherwise there would have been no such hegemonic war. Since the formerly prevailing hegemonic power is declining, the fact for this formerly hegemonic power to be part of the satisfied coalition winning the major war will nevertheless mean that this already declining power will no longer be able to rule the system. And therefore it will be the rising, most powerful state within the winning coalition that will overtake the role as the new hegemonic power. And this is what happened in 45, not in 1918, because America, who was the most powerful ally within the coalition of satisfied states, trying to cope with the rise of Germany, of dissatisfied Germany. The US in 1919, Wilson's project was rejected by the majority of American elites who wanted to remain faithful to America's isolationist tradition. But in 1945, America definitely accepted to intervene overall on the planet Earth, and the US thus became the hegemonic power after 1945, thanks to its huge resources. So let's sum up, ladies and gentlemen. The power cycle theory's major claims. According to the power cycle theory, stability, peace in the realist meaning of absence of major war and absence of risk of major war. Stability is possible and will prevail as long as there is a unipolar structure, as long as there is a hierarchy, a gap between the prevailing power's resources and the secondary power's resources. And a war is likely to break out when a system is characterized by parity. That is to say, when the system enters a transition phase with rising challenges, resources matching or being close to match the still prevailing hegemonic power's resources. The power cycle theory, though being shared only by a minority of scholars, be they historians or be they international relations scholars, I think that the power cycle theory is corroborated empirically. That is to say, if we look at the historical record, we see that from the beginning of the international system, roughly 5 centuries ago, there were 4 major cycles of hegemonic wars. The first one at the very beginning of the system, after the Middle Ages, from 1494 to 1521, the so-called Wars of the Italian Renaissance, at the origin of the rise of Spain as the prevailing power, the rise of Spain. Spain was prevailing during the 16th century, the so-called Siglo de Oro, the golden century of Spanish preeminence. The second cycle is the so-called 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, opposing mainly the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs to France, that was at that time the rising power, and France managed to win the cycle of wars, thus becoming under Louis XIV, the Sun King, the prevailing power on the continent. The third cycle is the cycle due to the French Revolution, the cycle of the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars from 1793-92 to 1815, opposing France, to the coalition of satisfied, to the coalition of states that wanted to check Napoleon's imperial ambitions, and you know that France lost, ended up losing the wars which permitted Great Britain to become the prevailing power. Throughout the 19th century, pretty often called Pax Britannica, the British Order, the British Peace, by historians. And since this British hegemony came to an end with the two world wars of 1914-18 and 1939-45. Great Britain, we said this 2 minutes ago, belonged to the coalition of winning powers, but the winning coalition of satisfied powers, but it nevertheless was too weak, and it is the US who became the new hegemonic power at the origin of today's world order since 1945, and all the more so since the end of the Cold War. So, historically speaking, there are four, I would say, empirical corroborations of the power cycle theory regarding its claim, according to which regularly such hegemonic wars do break out. Furthermore, the power cycle theory also can explain why these major wars broke out, why these hegemonic wars occurred. Let's take the example of the British hegemony throughout the 19th century and the end of its decline of this hegemony, provoking the outbreak of World War I and World War II. Pretty often the 19th century is considered to be a multipolar system. The majority of historians, Kissinger, the majority of realist scholars, Morgenthau, claim that the 19th century was multipolar, and indeed there were 4, 5, 6 major powers: Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, which became Germany, Russia, of course, and towards the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we can add Italy. But if we look at the distribution of power resources, of economic resources, there is no doubt that Great Britain actually was prevailing. Great Britain was prevailing as proven by an analysis of the British economist William Jevons. This is what he wrote in the 1860s. Listen to Jevons, who describes the preeminence of Great Britain, a worldwide preeminence. The plains of North America and Russia are our British, our cornfields. Chicago and Odessa are our granaries. Canada and the Baltic are our timber forests. Australia contains our sheep. In Argentina and on the western prairies of North America are our herds of oxen. Peru sends her silver to Great Britain. The gold of South Africa flows to London. The Chinese grow tea for us. Our coffee, sugar, and spice plantations are in all the Indies. Spain and France are our vineyards. The Mediterranean is our fruit garden. Our cotton grounds, which for long occupied the southern part of the United States, are now expanded everywhere in the warm regions of the earth. So this is a picture, a very significant picture of Great Britain's self-perception as dominating the world in the 19th century. And remember that, for instance, those who in Germany were in favor of protectionist economic policies, Friedrich List, notably, with his national economy theory, accused Great Britain exactly of dominating economically the rest of the world. So Great Britain was a different kind of power, superior to the 3, 4, 5 other powers, and therefore the system was much closer to a unipolar structure than to a multipolar one. And this prevalence, this preeminence gradually was challenged, first by the rise of America and then by the rise of Germany. The rise of America occurred as early as in the 1870s, when America economically became richer than Great Britain. But America was a satisfied power, or at least it was not interested in getting involved in international affairs. It focused on the Western Hemisphere, and at that time on the so-called Wild West, which it still had to, I would say, occupy efficiently after conquering it against the Indian tribes. So gradually, America became more powerful, but it was not perceived, rightly so, by the British as a threat. The British were still pretty powerful, whatever the rise of the US. The British Empire contained a quarter of the world population. The city of London was still the most important financial center. The Royal Navy, of course, was by far the strongest. But very, very soon, pretty quickly, the German economy matched and surpassed the British economy. In 1900, Germany came very close. And in 1913, that is to say, on the eve of World War I, Germany's part of the world economy amounted to 14.8%, 14.8%, and the British one fell to 13.6%. So 1 year before the outbreak of World War I, Germany had become economically richer than Great Britain. In other words, it was a very significant contender, since Germany indeed did no longer accept the British order. Bismarck, after unifying Germany, had adopted a prudent, fairly conservative foreign policy after defeating the Austrians and the French violently. But during 2 decades or so, up to the beginning of the 1890s, unified Germany remained fairly cautious. It did not behave aggressively. Things changed from the 1890s onwards. Bismarck was fired by Wilhelm II, William II, the new German emperor, who had world political ambitions. And these world political ambitions became a threat, were rightly so perceived as a threat by the British. Why? Because Germany's ambitions, Germany's expansionism could not but take place in Europe, for the very simple reason that the rest of the world was already divided among the major powers. You know that Britain and the French controlled the huge majority, the huge parts of Africa, but also the Middle East, and to some extent South and Southeast Asia. The Japanese, after their victory against the Russians in 1905, were very eager to control Far East and the Western Hemisphere. From the Rio Grande to Argentina became America's backyard. So since the colonial cake was divided among the then major powers, Germany's expansionism could only take place on the continent. That is to say, detrimentally to the French, the Russians, to the Austrians, and by upsetting the continental balance of power, Germany became a threat to the worldwide unipolar domination of the British. So at the eve of World War I, if we use what we said in our theoretical presentation of the power cycle, in our presentation of the power cycle theory, the system which had been characterized by British preeminence throughout the 19th century. From 1815 to 1914, the system entered a transition phase, a parity phase, because of the declining status quo, hegemonic power of the UK, and because of the rise of a dissatisfied revisionist, expansionist challenger, Germany. And thus, First World War I and then World War II broke out. These two wars were won by a coalition headed, above all, during World War II by America, and America thus became the new hegemonic power. We saw last week that the Soviets refused America's preeminence throughout the Cold War, but Gorbachev accepted it, and this permitted the Cold War to come to an end. And ever since then, 1991, America is acknowledged by secondary powers to be the legitimate leader in the world. So are things likely to change? In other words, let's apply this power cycle theory to try to foresee the future of American-Chinese relationships. And I would like to get started with, if you look at the documents, the very alarmist analysis put forward 6 years ago in 2014 by an American columnist, Ahrens is his name. He published this analysis on his blog, Market Watch. The title is easy to understand. It's official. He wrote, America is now number two. America is now number two. Let's quote some of his most important claims. Hang on to your heads, America. There is no easy way to say this, so I just say it. We are no longer number one. Today, we Americans are number two. It's official. Yes, it's official. The Chinese economy just overtook in 2014, just overtook the US economy to become the largest economy in the world for the first time since Ulysses Grant was president. Ulysses Grant, he who won the American Civil War, the War of Secession of the Southern states, was president at the beginning of the 1870s. So for the first time since Ulysses Grant was president, America is no longer the leading economy on the planet. It just happens, I go on quoting, and nobody noticed. Then he refers to the figures published by the International Monetary Fund. He emphasizes the fact that when we measure the American GDP and the Chinese GDP at the official exchange rate of the Chinese currency in American dollar, the US still is prevailing. And this is what power cycle theorists do. But if we look, this is what he emphasizes, if we look at the comparison in terms of purchasing power parity, that is, if we look at what people in America and in China concretely can buy for their money, he comes to the conclusion that China is the prevailing economy. China now accounts for 16.5% of the global economy, 16.5%. The US, 16.3%. So China overtook in 2014. And he then draws the conclusion, make no mistake, this is a geopolitical earthquake. This is a geopolitical earthquake with a high reading on the Richter scale. I go on quoting, throughout history, his political and military power have always depended on economic power. Britain was the workshop of the world before she ruled the waves, and it was Britain's relative economic decline that preceded the collapse of its power. And it was a similar story with previous hegemonic powers such as Spain and France. And his last sentence, this will not change anything tomorrow or next week. He wrote this in 2014. This will not change anything tomorrow or next week, but it will change almost everything in the longer term. Everything will be different on the long run. So there are two important points in Ahrens' analysis. The empirical statement put forward by Ahrens and the political, practical conclusion. Jaws, being an expert, he's interested in conclusions, in practical lessons that should be drawn, according to him, from the empirical statements. So the statement is the following one: America now is number 2 in the world economy. Why? Because Chinese GDP, in terms of purchasing power parity, overtook America's GDP. 2014. Ever since then, of course, the gap in favor of China is more and more significant. If you look at document number 5, we see that in 2019, according to the IMF, in terms of purchasing power parity, the US GDP amounts to $21,349 US dollars, 21,349. The Chinese one amounts to 27,438. 27,438 is significantly superior to 21,349. If we satisfy with the traditional comparison, that is to say, the measure of the Chinese GDP in terms of the official exchange rate of the Chinese currency in US dollars, then America still is the first economy, 21,349, to be compared to 14,140, 21,14. In other words, within the power cycle approach, America is still the preeminent economy. The Chinese economy, the Chinese GDP, amounts to 2/3 of America's richness. 2/3, not yet the 80% threshold. But, and this is at least as important if we look at the evolution over time during the 3 past decades of the Chinese growth, then there is no doubt that probably China will overtake America's economy in expressed, measured, compared at the official exchange rate, I would say within the next decade, at the latest in 2030 or so. All else being equal, of course. Why? Because 30 years ago, the Chinese GDP represented 7% of America's GDP. 7% 30 years ago. Last year, it represented 66%, from 7 to 66. So yes, we can expect that China will match America for what regards its economic richness within a decade or so. It's exactly what was foreseen by Ronald Tubman and the co-authors of his book. So this, therefore, indeed will be a significant change. We will enter a parity phase. Will this parity phase be a transition phase, that is to say, with a risk of a major war? Well, we have to look at what the possibility of what Ahrens calls the geopolitical earthquake that is likely to occur. And this geopolitical earthquake, of course, alludes to China becoming militarily significant. So let's look at the military spendings of China as compared to America's military spendings. In 2019, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China's military expenditures, official statistics, of course, amount to $261 billion. 261 representing 1.8% of China's richness, 1.8%. America spent 732 in absolute figures, and this represented last year 3.4% of America's richness. So both in absolute terms and in relative terms, China does not spend a significant percentage of its richness in order to acquire military assets. it is a bit more than 1/3 of America's expenditures in absolute terms. It's significantly less in relative terms, 1.8 of Chinese richness to be compared to 3.8 of America's richness. And if we look at the 3 past decades, what we see is that China never dedicated more than 2% of its economic richness to the military budget. So China does not, up to now, did not, up to now, have significant military ambitions. At first sight, this is good news, but actually it is not good news. According to the power cycle theory, this is anything but good news. Why? Because China reveals itself much smarter than America's former adversary, that is to say, the Soviet Union. If we look back to the Cold War, the USSR was a very significant military competitor. But it had established, it had developed huge military resources on a very weak economic basis. Never did the Soviet Union's GDP reach more than 45% at its best, beginning of the 70s, 45% of America's economic richness. China does not commit the same mistake, consisting in dedicating too huge parts of its economy to military spendings. The Soviet Union committed this mistake just as Tsarist Russia had committed this mistake at the end of the 19th century. It was defeated in 1914 when everybody saw that Russia actually was but a giant with feet of clay. China exactly adopted and still is adopting the opposite strategy. It first consolidates its economy, which amounts to saying that it will probably, in the future, once its economy very rich, it will start dedicating a more significant part of its richness to military spendings. This is exactly what Talent predicted. First, economic growth, then military ambitions, 1 or 2 generations later. And indeed, scenarios of the future predict that China, in the midst of the 2040s, so that is to say, in 25 years or so, should have a significant military budget likely to match the Western powers and above all the American military resources. So let's accept this idea that China will have the military means of its political ambitions within 1 generation or a little bit more or so. Of course, these ambitions must be interpreted in order to know whether China might be satisfied or not. Remember the theory, a peaceful transition is conceivable in the case of a secondary power being in the case of a rising power being a satisfied power, accepting the rules of the game. So the question then is the following one: will China be a satisfied power? Or will it adopt an assertive strategy? Will it be a dissatisfied revisionist state eager to impose its point of view in its region first and beyond, of course? The answer to this question is not easy, of course. If we look at our documents, he who is considered as the best expert on Chinese question in the US, Alistair Johnston, is pretty optimistic. He does not think that China will be assertive. Mearsheimer, we already quoted him, thinks that the opposite is true. There can be no peaceful rise. And he's not the only one. For instance, we also have Graham Allison in his book published 3 years ago, Destined for War. He thinks that America and China will hardly be able to avoid, to escape the so-called Thucydides trap. That is to say, he expects that a new war similar to the one opposing Athens to Sparta will characterize the future of American-Chinese relationships. Alistair Johnson is much more, I said it, is much more optimistic. And the official discourse of China also is a discourse emphasizing the peaceful intentions of China. Listen to this official discourse put forward by a member of the Chinese administration.
China has always been a peace-loving country. We have successfully walked on a road of peaceful development. We are now walking on a new road of win-win cooperation. China will never follow the footsteps of other big powers that sought hegemony once they grew strong. China has been and will continue to be a stalwart defender of our own national sovereignty and safety, and faithfully safeguard global fairness and justice, as well as actively facilitate international peace and development.
China is a peace-loving country, but it will defend its national sovereignty interests. So there's a kind of tension in this claim. China is a peace-loving country, ladies and gentlemen. This is exactly what the US said before becoming the world's hegemonic leader. America, during its isolationist tradition, considered itself to be different. It claimed that it was driven by economic objectives. It wanted to enrich itself. But then, after 1945, it became a military interventionist power, waging wars almost everywhere in the world. Why should China be different? China also claims that it will, thanks to its One Belt, One Road initiative, enrich the countries with which it will have privileged economic relationships. What will the future of China's economic presence be? Maybe it will be compelled to defend its economic richness. And how can you defend your economic richness if not by resorting to military strength? This is a question I would like to ask. The question is also asked, of course, by American policymakers, by American presidents, not merely by American academics. So for 2 decades now, 2 decades and a half, since the end of the Cold War, American presidents alternatively chose 2 possible strategies. Clinton's administration practiced the so-called engagement strategy, which was also rationalized by Alistair Johnston in a book published in 1999. America, said Clinton, has an interest in trying to, not merely trying, but in integrating China in the world economy. Thanks to this integration, and therefore China joined the World Trade Organization, China will be transformed into a satisfied state because it will understand that it will be in its interest, in order to increase its wealth, to respect the rules of the international system. So this strategy, the engagement strategy, is based on a liberal or kind of liberal constructivist optimist view, according to which states are socialized by international institutions. They gradually adopt democratic regimes, and democratic states do not go to war against each other. George W. Bush adopted the opposite strategy, that is to say, a strategy very close to containment, by supporting Taiwan, notably selling weapons to Taiwan. The strategy here was inspired by a realist approach. Whatever China's domestic evolution, it will have specific national interests, and these national interests will not be compatible with America's national interests. So China must be contained. Obama started with a more, a fairly strategy close to Clinton, that is to say, an engagement strategy before coming closer to a realist-inspired containment strategy. And of course, Trump, we know that, considers China to be America's most threatening adversary. What did he do? He launched the US-China trade war. He accused Huawei and TikTok of spying America, and therefore decided, or tries to ban them because they threaten America's national security. He denounced Beijing's policy, national security law imposed by Beijing on Hong Kong. He also supports Taiwan. I therefore come to the conclusion that American presidents gradually internalized the conviction that whatever China's domestic evolution, China will be America's next peer competitor, and therefore therefore there is a risk of a war opposing China, or conflict maybe escalating to war opposing China to the US. By doing so, of course, they bet on history repeating itself. Power cycle theorists and those who, among the politicians, agree, consciously or not, with this view, think that history, it's a realist approach, history will repeat itself. What was true 100 years ago when World War I broke out between the rising dissatisfied Germany and the somehow declining satisfied Great Britain, what was true 100 years ago may be true, may become true again in the future between the rising dissatisfied China and the declining satisfied US. A pessimistic outlook. This pessimistic outlook is rejected by those politicians or scholars who put forward mainly two arguments, trying to prove that the future will not look like the past. The first argument is a liberal one, and the second argument is a strategic one. First one is the liberal claim according to which economic interdependence is a force for peace, because by definition, two states trading with each other need each other, and therefore it would be foolish for them, counterproductive, to go to war against each other. By going to war, they would interrupt the trade which permits both of them, or the populations within both of them, to be wealthy. It is the famous trade not invade thesis, which trade not invade is the English equivalent of the French original le doux commerce. The thesis of the doux commerce states that have trade do not invade each other because they need each other. They are mutually interdependent. The theory goes back, the thesis goes back to Montesquieu. Realists do not share this optimism. They claim that interdependence actually is dependence and unequal dependence. There is one economy which is more dependent from the other one than this other one is from the first. And so they come to the conclusion that actually economic interdependence is synonymous with vulnerability, political vulnerability. And if you depend from the goods produced in another state, you also will end up being vulnerable regarding your own security. And security is more important for realists than wealth. You cannot be wealthy if you are not, first and foremost, safe. So the debate between liberals and realists opposes optimists and pessimists regarding the future of US-China relations. The historical record, what does the historical record say? Well, at first sight, liberals seem to be right. The 19th century, regarding major powers, European powers, was pretty stable. And indeed, during this 19th century, the economic growth profited gradually to more and more Western European populations. So we can, this is what liberals do, ascribe the then prevailing peace of the 19th century to the then growing capitalist interdependence. And there is no doubt that since 1945, Western economies, peaceful among each other, of course, were also economically more and more interdependent. What's more, the liberals can claim that World War I broke out when the major powers introduced protectionist policies, when they abandoned free trade. In other words, they have a positive and a negative argument, historical example, favorable to their thesis. But, and this is what realists say, the mere fact that in 1914, the Western European powers, despite their economic interdependence, nevertheless went to war against each other, tends to prove that they considered their political interests to be more important than their economic interests. Political passions claim, this is what realists claim, political passions prevail over economic rationality. And they also claim that at least as significant as the Western peace among Western free trading countries since 1945 is the fact that no war broke out between the US and the USSR, who were politically and militarily opposed. But they claim that when we look at the economic relationships between the two states, there was no interdependence. In other words, the less interdependence, in this case between the US and the USSR, the more stability. And so they too have historical, empirical examples favoring their approach, corroborating their approach. It is therefore very difficult to draw a general conclusion regarding the links between economic interdependence and the risks of war or the chances of peace. This is the conclusion drawn by Gilpin himself in another book, The Political Economy of International Relations. This is what he wrote after analyzing the same topic. Listen to Gilpin. No generalizations on the relationship of economic interdependence and political behavior appear possible. No generalizations. At times, economic intercourse can moderate, and at other times, it can aggravate political relations. Trade is not a guarantor of peace, but the collapse of trade has frequently led to the outbreak of international conflicts, armed conflict. No unambiguous conclusion. But maybe there is one way out of this kind of deadlock. It was found by Dale Copeland. Dale Copeland, in an article and then in this book, analyzing economic independence and the risks of war and the chances of peace with his trade expectation theory. Trade expectation, what does he say? According to Copeland, it is not the absolute amount of trade which is important. There is a lot of trade, there is not a lot of trade. It is rather the trade expectations, that is to say, states anticipate what their future amount of trade will be or not. If then states anticipate that this trade will go on in the future, they have no interest in staging an armed conflict. In this case, it would be foolish, since they can expect the positive effects of trade to go on prevailing in the future. But if they expect a decline, a decrease of their trade relations with another state, then they can no longer bet on the positive consequences of trade, and then the result to war, or the fact to consider that war might be a solution, this possibility then becomes rational again. In other words, war has a utility since trade expectations will be negative. He tested this theory in 1914, in 1939, Japan, according to Copeland, anticipated a decrease of its trade with the US. All the more so, the US decided economic sanctions against Japan. And since Japan was dependent on its foreign relations, on its foreign trade relations, and since it could not bet on good trade relations in the future with the US, war became a rational alternative. And this is, according to Copeland, what explains Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he also looks at the Cold War, when the Americans accepted to sell some goods to the Soviets that the Soviets were unable to produce, notably cereals in the 1960s, the second half of the 1960s. The tensions between the US and the USSR relaxed a bit. So there is a positive link between anticipated positive trade expectations and positive link and an improvement of political relations. The détente broke out, thanks, according to Copeland, to the Soviets anticipating positive trade relations with the Americans. So let's apply this theory to the US-China relations. There is, of course, no doubt that America and China are economically interdependent. But there is no doubt either that Trump launched a trade war. In other words, Trump is guided by a realist vision, consciously or unconsciously. He considers trade to be a zero-sum game and not a win-win game, not a positive game. In other words, he believes that America is vulnerable because of its depending on many products coming from China. He considers this trade to be unequal. In doing so, he may incite China to bet on a decline of the Chinese-American trade in the future. And if this is true, then China might come to the conclusion that an armed conflict with the US could have a positive utility. In other words, we should not be too optimistic regarding the future of Chinese-American economic interdependence as a peace-prone fact. The liberal argument is a good one, but it may not necessarily be the right one. There is a second argument claiming that the future of China and the US will be different from what happened between the British and the Germans 100 years ago. This argument is a strategic one. It refers to the impact of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons introduced a new factor, the possibility of the suicide of humanity, of mankind, and therefore it would be irrational. Actually, it is unthinkable that major states will go to war due to the risk of a nuclear winter. This also is a very optimistic, somehow perversely optimistic argument. Once again, we should be prudent. Why? Because if, and this is the so-called stability-instability paradox, if all the major powers agree in saying that they should not wage a nuclear war, because such a nuclear war would potentially mean the end of mankind. So if all the states agree on that, they also can come to the conclusion that no one will dare to start a nuclear war. But if all the states do believe this, they can end up believing that they can wage an intra-nuclear war, since nobody will escalate. And in this case, the nuclear factor will no more have an impact upon the risks of war and the chances of peace. To some extent, this is similar to what happened with the chemical weapons. The chemical weapons were used in 1914-18 by the Germans. Everybody expected this weapon to be synonymous with massive destructions, with massive negative consequences on mankind. Well, all the major states agreed in not using nuclear weapons, at least during World War II, though it is used sometimes in limited wars. So the nuclear taboo, we will not use the nuclear weapons, may favor non-nuclear wars, or at least may not prevent non-nuclear wars. In other words, it is not sure that technological arguments will prevail over political ones. So here again, we should be prudent. We come back to this topic in our chapter 10 regarding the impact of the spread of nuclear weapons. So a war, in other words, sorry for this pessimistic outlook, is not that impossible. A non-nuclear war. Will such a war break out? I do think that maybe it can be avoided. It can be avoided thanks to what Barry Buzan, the English-British theorist, called almost 40 years ago in the 1980s, in different contexts, therefore, what he called the security complex. What is the security complex? It is the idea that geography has a significant impact upon the so-called security dilemma, or merely on the way states perceive their security. Security complex, that is to say, that all else being equal, states are afraid of their neighbor before being afraid of a state geographically distant. This is logical. It is easier to invade your neighbor than to invade, to attack, to aggress a state that is not geographically contiguous. Look, let's apply this to America, China. The rise of China, by definition, due to China being part of the East Asian continent. The rise of China, and all the more so its prospective military ambitions, political ambitions, will, of course, be perceived as a threat by its immediate neighbors, South Korea, Japan, India, maybe Vietnam, maybe Indonesia, surely Australia. And if you look at these countries, they already, 50% of them are America's allies, Japan, Australia, South Korea. So the rise of China will be perceived by its neighbors as a threat, and what will then these states do? They will appeal to the US to maintain their security. In other words, there is a possibility for the US with its allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, plus India, plus maybe Vietnam, plus maybe, of course, Taiwan, plus Indonesia, the Americans will maybe create a kind of quarantine line around China to contain China's military ambitions. And if this is true, then China should be incited to stop short from going to war because of the risk of being defeated by this coalition of the US plus its regional allies plus NATO allies, of course. Whatever, ladies and gentlemen, the validity of this anticipation, of this prediction, of this scenario, what is beyond doubt is, as claimed by Obama, the US-Chinese relationship will shape the 21st century. He thought that this relation would be peaceful, at least this is what he thought in 2009 when he held this speech. Maybe we should be a little bit less optimistic and consider East Asia to be the core of the next great game, allusion to the British-Russian confrontation in Central Asia. East Asia and the Pacific Ocean will be the core of the next great game to come, opposing China to the US. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you will come back next week for our chapter 3, dealing with Trump's unilateralism. I wish you a great day. Goodbye.